right. Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me to come on.
It's a pleasure, definitely. I reckon we might want to just jump straight into it. One of the big things that we've discovered about you when we've been doing our research is that you got cancelled from a university. Would you like to go into a bit more detail of what exactly happened there and what was changed?
Sure. So basically, I'll say that I'll give a little bit of my background first. I'm a physical anthropologist, or what some people call a bioarchaeologist, and so my area of expertise is studying skeletal remains from the archaeological record. And in America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, there are laws that require the reburial of some of these skeletal collections, and I am against the reburial of skeletal collections. So I wrote a book along with my co-author, James W. Springer, that came out in 2020 that was timed for the 30th year anniversary of the big national US law on the issue, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And we wrote a book about the problems with this law and why we're against it and why we think it harms science, but also how one of the issues about reburial is that the reburial decisions are not based on science. They're not based on links between modern day people and past people, but rather they're often based on a victim narrative of the modern tribes claiming victimhood, and coupled with a religious narrative of creation myth. So we know we are linked to these 10,000-year-old remains because we have always been here, we've been created here. And so we basically challenged that argument. And that then led to my first cancellation. And I say my first because there are like a lot of them. And they're not all around the exact same topic, although they're all kind of floating around these issues. And so there was a huge campaign to try to get my book banned, with about 900 academics signing an open letter to call for the publishers to withdraw the book from sales. And my university got word of this, got wind of this, saw the Twitter's campaign against the book, and basically started to express concerns about my perspective. Even though prior to the cancel campaign, they had no issue with my perspective and they knew about it too. So that was the first of the issues. Then following closely upon that, I posted a picture of me with a skull, and I said, I'm so happy to be back with old friends, because I had basically been away from the collections, from the skeletal collections for, I don't remember exactly how long, but over a year because of COVID. COVID protocols shut down the university basically. And so I was really genuinely happy to be back at work, being able to study the skeletal remains again and to be able to curate them. So two aspects of what I do is I studied the remains to like reconstruct what their lives were like. These are all pre-contact individuals who I study, so trying to best tell their story most accurately. But I also curated the collection to ensure that it is well taken care of so that other researchers could come and study these collections. So after I posted that tweet, coupled with I wrote an op-ed for the problems of reburial that was published in a big mainstream newspaper in the Bay Area. I'm from the Bay Area, San Francisco originally, but I was at San Jose State University when all this was happening, a full tenured professor there. And that led my university to call out the photo as abhorrent, saying that I was being disrespectful, and basically taking retaliatory actions to lock me out of the collections and keep me away from all skeletal remains, including non-native skeletal remains and X-rays and non-human remains. When this was happening, it was there were other things that were bubbling around. For example, my department decided to put out a call that students on their listserv that students should use cite Black authors, and to remember that to cite authors of color. And I had responded that I think that skin color is irrelevant to who you cite. And so there were other things like bubbling around these issues of identity politics. But basically, when my university decided to take retaliatory actions against me to keep me out of the collections and to prevent me from doing my job, I sued them. And I got a legal foundation, Pacific Legal Foundation, to represent me pro bono, and I sued them to try to get back into the curation facility. Along those lines, another cancellation occurred in 2021 from the Society for American Archaeology. I gave a talk called, I can't remember the exact title of it now, but it was about that we should not use creation myths to rebury bones. And I said, if we're going to have to make these decisions, they should be made on evidence and not on mythologies. This led to a huge uprising in the organization's calls that I had maybe submitted an abstract with a completely different topic. Of course I didn't, or that I wasn't even a member of the society. Course I was, right? But they were trying to figure out how could I have gotten on. And I got on like anybody else. I went through the review. They thought it was a legitimate question of debate, and they put me on the schedule. Nevertheless, because of the whole cancel culture campaign against the talk, it was taken off of the platform 2 months before it should have been. The organization, the Society for American Archaeology, issued an apology for allowing me to be on the program, and basically changed their rules now so that anybody who has any questions about repatriation and reburial of bones will not be allowed on their program anymore. So that was 2021. Then later on, things were going along, and I was doing writing and things and pursuing my lawsuit. And then in 2023, I had actually, even after I had settled my lawsuit with the university, I was going to be on a panel with 4 other women about the importance of biological sex as a variable in anthropology. So one of the things I do is I look at sex differences in bones and look at how those sex differences then may impact health, may impact activities that they were doing. Was there a sexual division of labor and a status, social status? And so I was going to give a talk on this topic at the American Anthropological Association, and the other anthropologists on the panel were all going to talk about the importance of biological sex and the binary nature of it as well. And the whole panel got canceled. So that was my latest cancellation. Throughout this time, I've been continuously writing. I've done some research. I finally got access to skeletal remains from Carthage through my university. It took me about almost a year to do that. So I've been kind of doing a little bit of research, lots of writing, and one of the things that I did, I put together a book that chronicles all of these challenges, basically from the point of when the cancel culture started to, you know, come after me to now. And that book is on the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, that covers all of these topics and many more.
So when you were first cancelled in 2020, did that come as a surprise to you, or was it something that you sort of noticed could happen in the line of work that you're in that sort of industry of academia? Is that something that you were prepared to happen?
Actually, it came out as a complete surprise to me, because although I hold a controversial viewpoint on the issue of reburial, I've always held this viewpoint. I've written about it before. I've been interviewed by magazines like Science on the topic. I've never hidden the fact that this was my perspective, and I've talked about it openly. And, so it was an issue in that sense that I thought it would lead to a cancellation. My university, even wrote that they, knew that my viewpoint was controversial, but they supported me because it shows that they are a very, that very pro-academic freedom university. And so it was a surprise to me that I was being canceled. And when it started in 2020, I wasn't on social media, so I really had no sense of what was going on. The book came out in late September or early October 2020, and right around Christmas time, I got an email from my publisher saying, there's a lot of activity about your book on Twitter, and we're in crisis mode. We don't know what to do. We're getting this open letter, and I had no idea really the extent of it until that point. It's quite interesting that I was just completely oblivious, and so was my co-author. Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which is the book's title, was a very academic book. And I always thought, oh, we're going to publish it. It'll be cited a handful of times. Some people will read it, and that will be it. Now, I said 900 people signed the open letter to have the book pulled, but I don't think they all read the book. And I actually still think only a handful of those people read it. But one of the interesting things was my chair, the chair of the department, he wrote a letter to our academic community, both the graduate students and alumni and other professors and so forth, saying that he supports my academic freedom and so forth, and that my book may have caused discomfort, but that it's my perspective. It shouldn't be taken as the departmental perspective, but they support academic freedom. But then he ends that letter with kind of a condemnation of the book, calling it Victorian, saying that basically it's outmoded and so forth. And I thought, and that I have a linear view of science. And I thought, he didn't read the book. If he had, and maybe he did, but he didn't understand it. That's the other possibility. But if he had, he would have realized that we have a whole section in the book towards the end about how science is not linear, that it's not just linear. We give even some examples about how it's the growth of knowledge in science is not linear, and that it's kind of this mess of accrual. Some things get thrown out, some things get added, and detours go along the way. A whole section on that. So he obviously wasn't reading closely or didn't read it. But what happened was, as so many times, is you think that these people are going to be like, oh, well, they're going to stick up for academic freedom. But they're just saying that often. And behind the scenes, they're playing a different game. And so what I found out when I was suing my university is that they were basically going behind my back, trying to figure out ways to keep me from research, trying to figure out ways how to keep any resources away from me, and so forth. So, they put on this face of, yes, we believe in academic freedom or free speech, but behind the scenes, it's a different story. And one of the reasons why I was able to see this behind the scenes look is because when I filed for my lawsuit, of course, I got access to many of their emails in between themselves that were part of the requests for information for the lawsuit. But the other thing is my chair and my dean had even my chair hosted by my dean even had a talk for a national organization on chairs and deans called "What to Do When You're," and I always get this title wrong, but something along the lines of what to do when a tenured colleague is branded a racist. And then they basically laid out my case, why I was a racist, and what to do, including keeping resources away, making sure that everything is voted on, and that I will always be, not be in the majority kind of thing. And so in a sense, their empty words about academic freedom were that, empty words.
So, what do you think the long-term implications are going to be on cancel culture and academia and science in your area of expertise and science as a whole?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that, there are a huge number of different fields that are basically facing these kinds of cancel culture attacks. They can be very vitriolic, especially to the individual who's being attacked. And one of the things that I write about in my book is how so many of the people who are what I would call the woke warriors basically take a very ad hominem position of attacking me based on my appearance, on the way I talk about this or that. And they're not dealing with content. They're not arguing with content. I have no problem if people disagree with me on all sorts of things, including repatriation. I published with people who hold very different perspectives than me. But what cancel culture does is that it makes those that you're targeting a villain, and therefore people don't want to work with you. And what happens is that you're scaring other people from talking out, and I think you're increasing the likelihood of a monoculture where new ideas or off the wall ideas will be heard. And when there is a strong trend or fad, like whether it is for decolonizing the curriculum, or whether it is other identity politics issues, you're not going to get people speaking out because they're scared. And one of the things that happened along the way to me is that some of my colleagues, they would, and not in my department, but in the university in general, would reach out to me and say, I agree with you, but I cannot say it publicly. And this is it breeds a environment, a culture of fear, and this is deadly for science because sometimes the person with the wildest idea is right, is correct. And so I think that we're losing our ability to speak out against things that are viewed as controversial, whether it's the fact that sex is binary, or that whether it's on the issue of the origins of COVID, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, everything in between. But the other thing is, when we don't address these controversial issues, we won't necessarily come to the correct conclusions. And so if you look at psychology, if your conclusion is that certain people don't do well in certain fields because of systemic racism, then if somebody goes in that field and doesn't do well for another reason, and they are a person of color, they'll be like, oh, the teacher hates me, or it's because of systemic racism. And it may not be that at all. And so we're not doing people any favor by kind of kowtowing to this cancel culture to allow for incorrect explanations to be given forth. In my own area of study, one of the things is like a lot of the Native American tribes who are interested in reburying the remains blame their social woes like alcoholism, the missing women. They blame those social woes on the fact that bones are not buried. Well, we know that once those bones are buried, they will still have those social woes. They will still have the social problems. And so we haven't done them any favors by just saying, oh, yes, we understand, we're sympathetic to that. And therefore, yes, you can have the remains back. And you've left them still with no solution. And so I do think that this is a very big problem, whether it's about, hurt feelings or about real societal problems that need real solutions and not just, tiptoeing around controversial issues.
So the article, or was it an article that was written about you about, a professor being racist?
It was a talk that he gave.
And was that simply from the fact that you disagreed with the fact that they should only be citing coloured authors?
It was not only that, but he did mention that. It was that coupled with the repatriation and erasing the past book. And one other incident happened during that time. I went to a webinar on how to create an effective Native American studies program. Now, our department, our anthropology department, was housing the Native American studies program. And so I was interested in the issue. Now, the speakers, two of whom were Native American and one was not, their proposal on how to make a effective program was basically to hire Native Americans, and that Native Americans needed to teach the classes. They further went on to say that there shouldn't be any Hispanics, and that this is especially true, like even in office staff, like for like the secretarial staff shouldn't be Hispanic, because the problem is that if they're Hispanic staff, then those people, the Hispanics, may be mistaken for Native Americans, and wouldn't that be insulting? And I said that was racist. And I said, like, I don't have any Irish blood in me, but if somebody mistakes me for an Irish person, I'm not offended. I would only be offended if I thought there was something wrong with being Irish, and vice versa. So I said, if you don't think there's anything wrong with being Hispanic, why would you find it offensive in either direction? And so I was like, I just think that's really racist. And so I was called racist for pointing that out. And after the meeting, actually, my chair gave me a call, and he told me that I shouldn't attend those types of meetings anymore. And again, he acted like he was sympathetic to me. He said, I know that these places are just kind of echo chambers, and it's just better not to attend. And then he tried to play the guilt card on me. He's like, what if one of your junior colleagues was going up for tenure, promotion and tenure, and one person on the committee would be like, well, they're coming from the department with that problematic professor, and therefore doesn't get promotion or tenure. And I said, well, if it was me, he was like, well, how would you feel if you were that junior colleague? And I said, well, if it was me, I would stick up for somebody's right, a free speech and academic freedom, and I wouldn't want them to give that up for a biased decision on a promotion. And I would then challenge the decision through the normal channels. And but he didn't like that answer, and he basically told me not to attend those sessions anymore, which is in a sense a type of attack on academic freedom itself. And I mean, and maybe people think this is incredible, but even going to that webinar, I did not expect to hear those kinds of statements. I expected to hear statements about how you create classes that are of interest to a wide range of students, because the actual number of Native American students is quite low. You need to attract students of all types to those classes, or like how to integrate with other departments so that you reach students who maybe never thought of taking such a class. Those are the kinds of things I thought they would be talking about. I didn't think that they would be talking about ways to exclude Hispanics from the program, and so I was shocked. And one of the things that really bothered me throughout all of the cancellations that I faced is that there was always this kind of accusation, like maybe, whether it was from my chair who claimed that he really didn't know my position, or whether it was from the people challenging my talk at the Society for American Archaeology, or even at the American Anthropological Association, saying, well, maybe these people snuck in, they told a different, lied about what they were going to talk about, or told a different thing. And one of the things is that, maybe to a fault, I'm very open, I'm very honest and open, and it wouldn't even occur to me to hide my intent in order to get into some place. It's just not who I am. And so for them to kind of, suggest that, I'm some kind of Machiavellian genius sneaking into their safe spaces is just absurd.
So why do you think identity politics has sort of crept in and taken over academia?
I think it's a couple of things. One of the things is that in anthropology and a lot of the social sciences, and in general education classes. So like in the US, I know the system is a little bit different in different places. My brother was a professor in Edinburgh for many years. And my sister went to school in Reading and Trinity, so in England and Dublin and Ireland. So I do know that there are differences. But in the US, we have a system of general education for especially for public schools, where everybody takes a smattering of everything, right? And so this means that almost everybody in public schools takes an anthropology class at some point in their career, which is great in some ways if they're great classes. But what it's meant is that the postmodern agenda that has flooded the social sciences has affected far more than just the social science students. And what we get in anthropology is, in the really taking off in the 60s, we get a movement towards a postmodern agenda where what's important is that who's telling the story and not if the story is accurate, and splits the world into the oppressed, which for anthropologists are, the Native Americans, people of color, indigenous people around the world and the oppressors, which are the Western colonizers. And we see this in history classes now too. And I think that this has taken over to the extent that there is no more nuance on that. Obviously, bad things have happened around the world to various people at various times. I'm not saying that there isn't some truth to that, but I'm saying that it cannot be the overriding story. The main point should be trying to get the past, reconstruct the past as accurately as possible, not drawing up, the noble savage that can do no wrong versus the evil white person that can do no right, right? And that's not the way you're supposed to go about it. But that seems to be what happened. I think part of the reason why this has now flooded as the academia is because it's actually a much easier thing to do to tell this narrative than dig into the facts and try to figure out the very complex past and do the actual research. And so it's the same thing, and I think this is going on with the hard sciences too. It's much easier to go into physics if you're going to be a physicist who's going to just talk about how physics has always been controlled by white men, than actually learn physics and teach it, right? So I think that there is some of it is like, people who are taking the easy road, and they may not even realize that. But like for me, one of the things, I went into anthropology because I love the field. I think that skeletal remains are fascinating. I think anatomy is fascinating. And I think the fact that you can reconstruct what people's lives were like looking at bones is a fascinating field, but it's also important. It's important not only for the intellectual value that brings us to understand all sorts of people, and that understanding, what improvements have occurred, but also, the strength and resilience of people in the past. I used to teach a mummies class, and there's a great story about a family that was died from the collapse of a avalanche. And basically, one of the women in this pre-contact with the West families, she had horrendous health problems. She had, an infection in her main heart artery, for example. She was facing kidney failure. She had severe anthracotic, like black lung that you expect from coal miners and all this stuff, because their life was so hard. And yet she survived, and with signs of healing. This is amazing, and I think that it really shows the beauty of people's resilience. And that's one of the things that I love about anthropology. And I also think that, skeletal anatomy is beautiful from the way that of a form and function perspective, but also bringing us together, showing us how similar we are to other animals and to each other, and how human variation is not just on the surface, but goes straight down to the bone. And so that's why I went into anthropology. And I think that when people go into anthropology, like many people now, who go into anthropology because they just want to basically push their political agenda on, or identity politics, that might be easier than learning all the stuff about skeletal remains and about bones and about diseases, but it's not more interesting, and it's not a better way to understand the past. And we lose more than just this, fascinating field, but we also lose the next generation of forensic anthropologists, which is going to be so essential. Forensic anthropology is a field that you really need hands-on training to get there. And if without skeletal remains, we will not have another generation of anthropologists. And in the US, especially in California, skeletal remains, even teaching collections, are under attack by those interested in identity politics and the postmodern agenda.
Yeah, the barriers that, well, first of all, politics shouldn't, on a grand scale or grand level, politics should have never really even been involved with science at all. They've got no actual connection on the grand scale, but obviously in today's day they do. When you earlier on in our conversation you discussed about they want to rebury the bones because of creation myths. How's that debate going? Is that sort of is it everything leaning that way where they will be reburied throughout the rest of the time?
Yes, everything is leading that way, and actually even more so this year, more and more laws have been put into place. State laws, for example, that increase the risk of reburial, and also changes to the national law. But it's not just in the US. Australia, New Zealand are facing the same issue. Canada is, in the UK, a lot of it is about returning artifacts and remains from museums back to the other nations. So there's a lot of that going on. And a part of this is, the indigenous are saying it's because of their creation myths. Academics seem to want to deny that that's the argument that the Native Americans and other indigenous populations are using. But the reason why academics are, allowing this kind of creation religion to take hold is because the Native Americans in the US and indigenous groups in the other places are considered the oppressed, and therefore what they say goes. So it feeds into that. Just recently, Mungo Man has been reburied. This is a 40,000-year-old skeleton from Australia. Cow Swamp in Australia has been reburied. That was 13,000 to 22,000 years old. But the other issue becomes that it's not just about reburial of bones. There's also a movement to destroy data, destroy casts, destroy photos. In my own university, they're planning on burning X-rays that have been taken. And part of the reason for this is because they want to control the narrative. And so they don't want any data being used to challenge their creation myths. The repatriation and reburial activists, that is, don't want any data being used. And overall, there's a movement to remove skeletal remains from display in museums. And we have the Smithsonian, which is the national museum in the US, right? The National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian. Smithsonian's actually a branch of museums, but they have the National Natural History Museum, which is very difficult to say. But they have decided to remove all skeletal remains from display. And they had this exhibit called Written in Bone. And this Written in Bone exhibit displayed, it was a exhibit and an online companion exhibit for teachers that combined archaeology with physical anthropology and with forensics. And the collection was from Jamestown, so a colony, an English colony. And the remains that were being displayed were not Native American, they were colonialists. And one of the interesting, and the Jamestown colony is famous also for they had like massive starvation and ended up in cannibalism. And so it's a very famous colony. And so they had this exhibit called Written in Bone that was online for teachers to be able to use to get their their students interested in the topic of forensics and anthropology and so forth. And they've taken that down now. And in place, there's a 4-page apology about the exhibit that includes a statement that basically says, you know, that they took it down due to being more sensitive and more ethical. And ironically, they even say in the statement that the ancestors of the Jamestown folk, the Jamestown people, were in favor of the exhibit and of the online website. But those people's position doesn't matter because they're not the victims, they're not the oppressed, even though it's literally their ancestors. It's a museum who's saying, no, we know better. We're not going to show this anymore. And so over the years, people have always said, well, how would you feel if it was your ancestors? No, I wouldn't mind at all. And now we have the answer. Even if people who are perceived as non-victims don't mind their ancestors being shown, those ancestors will still be taken away from display because it's not our decision to make, even if it's our ancestors, which is just the absurdity of it. I'm not sure why this has gone so quickly off the rails, but in the last just year or two, it has.
Yeah, when you say, would you mind if your ancestors were shown in a museum? I'd be sort of proud of it. I'd think.
Yes, yeah, I would be too. And like my parents, they have signed, you know, when they pass away, they have signed off for their bodies to be donated to science. And you know, I'm not saying that everybody needs to do this, but it's kind of an arrogance to assume that nobody would want to. You know, the Egyptians are extremely proud of the ancient Egyptian pharaonic period and the mummies. You know, so it's culturally it's kind of like cultural appropriation to think that everybody would feel the same way, or you know, we are not a monoculture, and I would argue that we actually should be trying to show people the wonder and the usefulness of remains, and not, you know, forcing them to make decisions, but showing them this, and hopefully, you know, having them come to conclusions that would be pro-science and also pro-humanity. One of the, you know, a good comparison is that there used to be massive problems with organ donations in Catholic countries. And there's been a movement to, you know, promote organ donations so that, you know, this can save people's lives. You know, people may say, oh, well, that, you know, this was really important to Catholics not to donate their organs, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about, you know, the importance of organ donations. And one of the things is that anthropologists have been at the forefront actually of saying, you know, we understand there's this kind of conflict in many people who want to donate their organs. They think they cannot donate their body to, for example, a skeletal collection that would be used in forensics. And so universities have worked in conjunction with medical, you know, anthropology departments working in conjunction with medical schools, so you can do both, which is wonderful because that's really, you know, in a way, you know, a kind of gift that, you know, is priceless.
Yeah, when you say with the way it seems to be going with science at the moment, and you say it's going to affect the next generation, which you can clearly see it will, and then even worse for the generation that comes after that, it almost feels as if science by that point will literally just be a textbook, which everyone gets given. And then you read the textbook. This is science, this is history, all in one. This is everything that's gone on. This is what you need to read to know. And we're not doing any more research. Close the book and move on. It feels as if it's going that way, but is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Is there anything that you feel would shake up the industry enough to get it back to how it should be?
Well, I think that there are a couple of points of light that that are important to highlight. For example, there is some backlash against the movement to get rid of the category, the sex category, the concept of the binary sex, and also to promote research on why body dysmorphia exists and in the transgender issue. And so I do think that that's one of the area where there is light. And I think, you know, the UK has basically stepped away from transitioning young people. And this is in part because research was done and they thought, you know what, there's not enough data here to continue on. I think the way to make these changes is actually to highlight the worst case scenarios, because I think then people are like, oh my goodness, what's going on here, right? And so you do have to kind of shake people up that way. I'm not sure how anthropology is going to do it. I mean, one of the things I do with on the Warpath, my new book, is like I try to give some really good examples of the absurd to make people think like, you know, we're losing so much for this absurdity, right? And so I do think that that's an issue. We have, you know, a lot of people are interested in these topics, and I think that that is an important point too, that we shouldn't necessarily give up the fight, even if it seems like we're not making any headway. Anthropology, in some ways, is a particularly interesting case because our data cannot really be replaced, right? It's very difficult to replace that data, whereas many other fields, I think, will survive and will come back strong. So what does that mean for anthropology? It might mean that we have to realize that we lost a whole bunch of data and have to rebuild up that data. And I think there can be a rebuilding up of the data, but it will take longer. Anthropology is such a wondrous field. I cannot imagine that, you know, we won't be able to re-spark that interest and get people back on track. It's just a matter of the logistics in some ways, and getting enough of a movement to say, you know what, we shouldn't be putting our present day politics on past people's. We should be trying to understand them for who they were without our, you know, identity politics lens, whether that's queer anthropology lens or, you know, the Black trowel movement lens, or whatever lens you talk about. It needs to be, we need to understand people how they were from their perspective the best we can.
Do you see the tide sort of changing within the next 5 years? Because I feel over the previous 5 years, there's been a massive push for this woke culture. And it feels like in just normal society, the tide's starting to change a bit, and people are starting
I do think that there is I do think that there is somewhat of a tide changing. I just came back from a Heterodox Academy conference in Chicago, and there were 400 attendees. So, you know, that's pretty good. It talks about the problems of trigger warnings and the problems of diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. So I do think that that the tide is turning. Will it be 5 years or 10 years or maybe even 20? I don't know, but I do think it will turn. The question, I guess, is what will be left when the tide has turned? How much of that is going to be left? I think that it's important that even in even in even in academia, that we don't completely abandon it, so that that there, I loved my job, and I'm now retired. I settled my case, and that settlement included me retiring early. But I never tell others, up and coming students who are interested in going into the field, don't go in. Like, yes, we need people like you in academia. So I encourage people to go in, even if it might be a little bit painful. But it is still, being a professor is a great job. And the thing is that, in a way, I think that people think, oh, well, you wouldn't want to be in that kind of cancel culture environment. And that is true. But it's not like it's only in academia, it's all around us. And so, but I think that professors have a bigger part to play to turn it around if they can. So, but like, I mean, would if I was in Facebook, would I have been canceled? Probably, and I wouldn't have even gotten a settlement, right? So it's not just academia. That's the thing. And so I encourage people, yes, go into academia, do the best you can, and keep people's minds open. And so I do think that universities are still important, and I do hope that the tide turns.
Yeah, because it's like when you were discussing about your cancellation earlier, you said that that you were called linear, but when you actually look at the cancel culture, they're doing nothing but create a linear space. So the more of these sort of up and coming people that go into academia, if they can go in there to prove that it is more interesting not being linear, because what they're doing, if you look at it, if it keeps going the way it's going, sooner or later people are going to look the other way and think this side's way more interesting because they're having debates, they're talking about things, they're actually challenging their minds. Whereas on the linear path, it's all a bit, well, it's 1+1 = 2. But you don't want, sooner or later people look on the other side and think, oh, these guys are shaking up the industry a bit more. Let me go. It just basically will just attract more people.
And the other thing is that, and in my field, the other thing is, as you said earlier, what are we going to be doing just looking at a single textbook? Whereas, I love to read. I absolutely love to read, but there's nothing like looking at real bones, right? So getting that hands-on experience, which cannot be substituted for. And I think that when we start losing students because they're like, well, if there's no real bones, I'm not interested in this. Maybe people will be like, oh my goodness, to keep my job, we have to fight back against this kind of reburial. The other thing is that in Europe still, there is a fairly robust culture of bioarchaeology and archaeology, and they have field schools where they take students out in the summer to excavate in cemeteries and so forth. And I think that some of these people coming back from those experiences will want to replicate them in the US, in Australia, and New Zealand, and will be disappointed when they can't, and therefore will fight for that ability in other places as well.
Yeah. When's your new book's being released?
It has been released. I actually have a copy right here. So it's on the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. It's from Academica Press. And one of the reasons why I went with Academica Press is because I knew that they wouldn't try to make me play down any of my issues or edited away some of the very outrageous things that happened to me. But the other thing is Jim Flynn, who is a psychologist who passed away not too long ago, maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago now, he wrote a book on the free speech issues and cancel culture in academia. And he's famous for the Flynn effect, which is the rise in IQ over generations. And he, noticed all this cancel culture coming up. And so he decided to write a book about it. And his usual publisher that he published many books with accepted it. And then a cancel culture campaign heard about it and basically stopped it from being published. And Academica Press saved that book. And that's what put them on my radar. I was like, they saved Jim Flynn's book. They're not going to back down from anything controversial. And so they've been great so far. The book is available at like all the regular online retailers, including, of course, Amazon. And it's on Kindle in a hard copy and paperback, and at a really reasonable price. So it's under $30 for the paperback, for example. So I'm hoping it gets a lot of attention. I'm hoping hoping to sell a lot of books, right? But I want to say that it's not an academic book in the sense of it's not made for only an academic audience. Through my years, I've always loved popular science books, whether they're written by like the Leakey family, Richard Leakey, Louis Leakey, on their excavations in Africa, or Jane Goodall's books, right? So on chimpanzees, and there's all sorts of popular science books that I think really tell so much about the field, but also are written in a way that can reach a much wider audience. And so I decided to write it as more like a pop science book to be able to reach as many people as I can. And so it has a lot of information there, but it also tells my story of the cancellations. And it's, I try to include humor in it. And so it's not a book that people might say, oh, well, I don't think I could understand it. You'll be able to understand it. And I hope that people from all backgrounds will pick it up, read it, and see, what's going on in anthropology and academia more widely.
Yeah, it's definitely something that people need to hear about. How long's the book been out for so far?
Just a couple weeks.
Oh, okay. So it's not been out for long enough for people to voice their opinions on.
Yeah. So it's. I think that the Amazon started shipping out copies on the 10th of this month, so just a couple days ago.
Oh, okay.
And the publisher shipped out copies a little bit earlier, but so it's just been out.
You mentioned the Flynn theory. Do you know much about
that? I know a little bit about it. So I was married to a psychologist before. He studied race and IQ. So I don't know if you know him. He's passed away now. He's Jean-Philippe Rushton. And so I met Jim Flynn at conferences where Phil and I would go. Sometimes I'd go to his conferences with him. And Jim Flynn himself was the epitome of kindness, and was just a great person. Every time, when you're young and just starting off, sometimes there'll be people who, will talk to you as you're a child, and other times people will talk to you as if you're, a budding scholar. And he was one of those who would talk to you as a budding scholar, which is always greatly appreciated. So basically, he was actually not a psychologist, but and I can't remember his field, but he was not a psychologist. Maybe he was a philosopher originally, but he noted that pretty much in every generation, the average IQs raised. And that this might be from a variety of factors, including improvements in the environment. So like one of the possibilities is that when we took much of the lead out of our environment, like with leaded gasoline even, you get a rise in IQ. So his was a theory that it has to be something that affects a large range of people, because it happened, it wasn't like one population faced it and not another. And so, that it was almost like a global phenomenon. And there might, of course, there's some genetics at play and natural selection maybe, but so that's kind of what I know. I do think that they've now said that the Flynn effect has stopped. So that the last time they looked at it, that there wasn't a rise in IQ this last chunk of time. So it might have stopped, but don't, I might be wrong. I just have it in the back of my mind that I read that the Flynn effect has stopped.
That might be down to the rise of social media and TikTok.
Yeah. Big drip down,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you know when you went through your years of cancellation? I guess like 3 years of just being cancelled.
Yeah.
How did, so obviously with you being in a university, what was the reception that you had with the people around you that you've just been cancelled?
It's quite interesting because of course it happened in the middle of COVID. So a lot of it was like online stuff. It was like we were completely off campus for a long time. I think it was a year and a half, if I'm not wrong. But so a lot of it was, I didn't see anybody in person. And then when we finally got back, people were so hesitant to come back that the halls would be empty. So that has good effects and bad effects. One thing is that, I wasn't facing a lot of people. So it's easy, that made it easier. Now, when I did run into people, I was always civil and friendly because I'm just not a person who's rude. It's just not in my nature. Even if I can't stand somebody, I might be a little like more curt with them, not chatty, but I'm not rude. I'm just be like, hello, and go on my way. Some people would just like not say anything to me, like completely ignore me. But what the other aspect of it is, on the flip side, people feel that they can be a lot meaner online. And so I think that there was a lot more nastiness, but it did lead to some very funny moments. And one of these I talk about in my book as well. And one of my colleagues got so upset with me on a Zoom meeting for my pointing out that he had also made a similar raised a similar issue that I had raised and in a previous meeting. And he got so upset with me for pointing this out that he was like, well, you seem to be enjoying this. And I was like, I just think it was a little bit funny that people were like, oh, nobody's ever pointed out these kinds of things. I'm like, yes, they have. And, like about, when you have a job contract, it gives you certain duties. And you can't just take those duties away by vote of the committee, of your colleagues' committee. That's your job contract. And that was what it was about, because they wanted to take away my curation duties, or, and I was like, it's literally written in my job contract. But the funny thing is that this person got so upset that he literally got up and walked out of the meeting, only to have to walk back because he had just walked out of his own living room. He was on Zoom. So it's like these kind of absurdities. So how would it have been had I been in person? It's so hard to say. Now, in all fairness, as a department, we were never super close because a lot of people lived very different places. And so it wasn't like we were going out after work. We were always friendly, and I felt like very collegial. And so it was odd from that perspective, but it wasn't like I lost like these deep, dear friends, right?
Yeah. So if you had to give advice to some, no, I wouldn't even say professors, right? Because like you said
Right.
earlier, it's over all industries and
Yeah.
people are just not voicing their opinions. A lot of the time, I see it in a lot of meetings that I have. People just don't voice their opinions no matter what it is, just in case
Yes.
they don't know if they're right or wrong with a lot of
Right.
what they say now. But so what advice would you give to people that have got thoughts and they want to express their opinions, but they're afraid to? What would you say to them?
Well, I think that, I personally feel like if it's not relevant to the specific thing you're like in a meeting, like I would only, when I was doing my work, I only brought these up when it was relevant. So if we were talking about so I didn't opine away if we were talking about, let's say we were talking about, setting up, how are we going to set up the classroom? That so realize that there is a place and context that where it's the most useful to bring these up, and in those cases it is important to bring them up, and so to make sure that when there's a time and place to bring it up, that you do speak up. One thing is, because if you don't, if there's another person who feels that same way, they're not going to speak up. So we need to know like who's the silent minority or majority are. But the other thing is, it's very difficult to live a lie and to live in silence. And eventually it will come out, and you won't be any better off for it that you had been hiding it for years. And realize that the cancel culture attackers, the woke warriors, they will spin the story how they want it spun, and they will tell their perspective on you regardless of whether it's true or not. One of the things that my chair said was, he said, well, she's at this meeting about what to do with at this talk about what to do with a tenured colleague who's a racist. um, the, she was never warm and fuzzy. She's an odd one. She was never warm and fuzzy. And I'm like, one thing is, I'm not quite sure what that means. But the other thing is, I was like, what a disingenuous way to portray my interaction with the department that I was 18 years at when this had already started, considering that I was always friendly, considering that I signed every card that was in the, like birthday cards, so forth. Considering that when my colleagues got sick, I stepped up to take their classes without asking for compensation. Considering that I crocheted baby blankets for some of it. Like, how much more warm and fuzzy do you want, right? And like, just keep your sense of humor, because these things will happen and you just have to laugh at it. So I think that one of the things is, speak up, because you don't know who else is being quiet because they're afraid to speak up. Laugh when you can, because a lot of it is absurd and needs to be laughed at. And the other thing is, make sure you have a safety net. And I think that, for academics, actually, for a tenured professor, it is hard to fire one. So that is a safety net. I do think that had I not gotten legal help, I do think that they were trying to fire, they were going to fire me. I think that all the lines were there, the evidence was there that that's what they were planning to do. They talked about giving me an incompetency rating on my next review. And that would be grounds of firing a tenured professor. So I took action and before they could try to fire me, before they could, bring a case against me, I took action and I proactively sued them. So instead of waiting for it to get fired and then suing them to get my job back. Now, had I gotten fired, maybe the book would be better. I don't know, but but in the same token, it would have been very painful. And I was ready for that. I was mentally ready for that. I had other safety nets that I was like, if this happens, we were ready for it, but I didn't want it to happen. And so my thing is, to have a safety net and to, also, make sure that you have people around you that will be supportive. I have a very supportive family. My parents, my siblings are very supportive. My husband's very supportive. So I do think that it's much easier to go along when you have support. And I can't even tell you how many emails of support I got throughout these years. People reaching out to me, from all walks of life, telling me that that they've read a story about me, they've read an article I've written, that they're aghast at what's happening. And some of those people, even now 3-4 years on, I'm still in contact with. Many of them are very bright, and I'm, thankful for that. And so realize that you're not alone, and that there are so many people out there who do love the science, who do love scholarship, and who don't want it to be, kiboshed with cancel culture. And even people who may disagree with you on many things, they still see the huge problem of basically attacking an individual for just having a different perspective.
Yeah, with what science should be. I mean, I think from our conversation today and what I've read about you, and I've seen you on a couple of other podcasts too, is that you've been cancelled, but you sort of wear it as a badge of honor to make other people. It sort of like gives other people the perception of not being afraid of it and don't run away from it. If it happens, it happens. But it's like you said, the biggest problem is the safety net. A lot of people don't have that safety net, and they might have, I don't know, just had children, or they might have just taken out a mortgage, and so therefore they're just going to be quiet, comply, and take their paycheck home every month.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I also think that for those of us who have spoken out and who have faced this issue and who have spoken out, I think it's important to realize that not everybody can, and therefore those people who can really do need to. So if people, some people have a sick spouse at home, or they have children that they're worried about, so I do understand that, and therefore, I try to, say, if you're in a position to speak out, it's almost like your obligation to, right?
Yeah, like it's your duty. If you're in a position where you can, then just do it and shake things up as much as possible.
Do you think your case with the university, and obviously your success in winning the case, has sort of set a precedent against cancel culture in academia?
In some ways, I wouldn't even say that I won the case. I settled out of court. And the settlement was a good settlement. I'm happy with the settlement, but I would say that both parties, me and the university, got something that they wanted. So, but the thing is, like, one of the things was that my case was very difficult in one way, because it had the problem of the Native American issue entwined in that. And in the US, Native American tribes are considered sovereign, and you cannot sue them. But in my case, I was required to sue them to go forward. And so basically they were considered like a necessary party for the case, but I could not sue them. And so everything related to the Native American issue, from the bones to the x-rays to the animal bones, because they were at the site of the same site, to getting into the curation room, to getting into the room with the skeletal remains, all of that was basically taken off of the table. And the judge said, because you cannot include the Native Americans and they must be included, that part is taken off. And so what I was left with was, the Carthage collection, some issues about teaching and other and free speech issues. And I had fought so hard along the way of each step, that I clawed back those things. And I think I would not have been able to had I not been suing them. So like one of the things is like when you file a lawsuit, people get on their good behavior, right? So all of a sudden my chair was being, was behaving better, towards me. So, but like one of the things, for example, was when they took over the curation facility and decided to have new protocols in order to get access to the remains, or even be in that facility, they wrote in a menstrual taboo. They said menstruating personnel are not allowed in the curation facility and cannot handle any remains. And one thing is, they didn't say women, they said personnel, because they didn't want to admit that women are the only ones who are menstruating. But the other thing is that this is actually against the law. It's a Title IX. Title IX is a law that says that you cannot discriminate against somebody based on sex in the educational setting. And so like, if you give the boys a chance to do something, women have to have that same opportunity. And we see a lot of this issue arising in sports, and now with the trans issue in sports. But like, when they put this in place, I immediately told my lawyers about it, and we immediately went to them and said, if you do not take this off, we will file a second claim, and that will be a Title IX claim. And they took it off, and it's still taken off. And so in a sense, although I didn't win the big case, I won the small battles. And those are still important to win. So I did, I got that removed. I got access to the Carthage collection. I prevented a photography ban from being put into place. So I won those along the way. And I would say that at the end of the day, when I decided to settle my case, I did so because I had gotten everything that I could get. And the things that I really wanted were off hands for me because of that tribal sovereignty. And so I do think that people who are thinking about suing their university should do so if for academic freedom and free speech issues, and that they should not see my case as, oh well, she settled and that's kind of a loss, but rather that my case had this very specific wrinkle in it, and that I actually won a lot just even before getting to the final endpoint. And so I do think that it's kind of a mixed bag, but let's say that this case had never happened, like I had not been a victim of cancel culture, that none of this had ever happened, and the collection that I had access to and was curating was going to be reburied, I would have retired anyway, because I didn't want to just stick around teaching. I love teaching, but I don't love only teaching. Research on skeletal remains was an important aspect of my career, and so I wanted to continue that. And so because I saw no avenue to do that in my position, I decided to retire. Had I not had any of this happen to me, and and that collection would be off limits, I would have made the same decision. The only thing is, instead of retiring with being my last year in San Jose, just teaching and not doing any research, I got the opportunity to come to New York City to spend a year with Heterodox Academy, looking at museums, looking at the problems in museums. I was kind of hopeful that maybe museums would be a better place to study skeletal remains, and they're even worse. But at least I, explored that, exploring other avenues. And what I plan to do is to continue to write about these problems, continue to fight for anthropology, and continue to look for collections to study. Being retired, now I have the time to be able to do that. If I was still at my position in San Jose, I wouldn't have had the time to do it, and my university wouldn't have supported me financially to do it either. So I think that that's the other aspect. Now, one of the important things is that I made sure that in my settlement that I retained what we call emeritus status. So I'm emeritus status is basically a professor who's retired but still holds the status of a professor. So I still have my academic address, still have my academic access to journals and all that stuff, and still can apply for grants and so forth. So that was very important to me.
Okay. Well, so you could go and do some independent research in the near future.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And that's my plan.
Yeah, well, that's a great. I mean, you've got a passion for it, and so since you've retired and you've been sort of fighting against the system within academia, have you found like a community within the same field that are joining you on this fight?
I do have. There are some anthropologists who are on the same wavelength, so to speak, and we are actively looking for ways to perhaps even take to start a legal case against some of these laws.
Right. Yeah, it's probably the best if you've got the community there as well, that more influence and more people will join. But I didn't know that about Native Americans, that you can't sue them if you're in America.
Yeah, most people don't, and then they get into an issue with them, and they're like, "Oh no, I can't sue them." That's why in certain places where there's a high percentage of Native Americans, like Oklahoma has, I think Oklahoma has the highest percentage of Native Americans in the U.S. And there's all sorts of nightmare stories about people who decided to hire tribal members to fix their roof or to fix something, and then the people just don't do it, or they leave it half done, and they can't sue them. Whereas if they had hired somebody else, they could sue them.
Doesn't the fact that you can't sue them cause more problems for the sort of Native American population because people won't want to do business with them?
Yeah, it does. That's basically one of the outcomes, is that you end up getting these advice websites and so forth that say, don't hire a Native American architect or contractor, because if they leave with your money, you can't sue them. And so it is harmful to them to have this reputation. And ironically, or maybe sadly, it's going to be the most honest people who are harmed by this the most, because they're going to lose out on possible jobs that they would have done well.
Can they sue each other?
Oh, you know what? I don't know that. I think they can, because I think they have tribal courts, so they can sue each other in courts, in their tribal courts.
Oh, right. Okay. I don't really know an excessive amount on Native Americans.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, and I found out about that when repatriation and erasing the past was being done, but I hadn't even thought about it beforehand. So even it just was not even on my radar. you know. So
Yeah, if your case was with like a different race or a different yeah, if it was with a different race, then it would have a totally different outcome, right? Because that was one of the big playing cards that you had on your side.
right. I think that is absolutely true. I actually think I would have won the case outright, even from, you know, pretty quickly had it not been that, because it's not about how meritorious it is, not about how good of a case it is. It's basically, well, it's dismissed because you can't sue them. You know?
And do you feel like because that department in particular had the Native Americans in, they were a little bit like less lenient against you in terms of the things they were well saying to you and about you because they knew that they had a bit of a safety net themselves?
That could be, but I'm not sure that they realized that until the case was you know, yeah, I'm not sure that they realized it. I think that they probably didn't realize it beforehand, because it wasn't like nobody, most of the people in my department were not most of the people in my department studied other groups. So I suspect that it was just their good fortune and my bad fortune.
Oh. Oh. Well, this has been amazing to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elizabeth. It's been great.
No problem.
We'll keep it up, and I hope your book is super successful. We'll leave all the links in it below.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me on, and let me know when it's the links and so forth, and I will post it on my Twitter and so forth.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck with the book, and then, well, obviously going to keep an eye on what you're up to when you get your next book ready, and we'll have you back on when that time comes.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries.
Cheers, Elizabeth. Bye.